All right, hello everyone. It looks like we're gonna get started. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, and welcome. My name is Lucy Barnum, and I am a journalist with YR Media, which is a national platform for youth storytellers based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm also an undergraduate student at Northwestern, and over the past year, I've done a lot of reporting on how the pandemic has impacted adolescents, my peers, and I'm thrilled to be emceeing our webinar today. This Returning to School webinar is co-hosted by the Center for the Developing Adolescent, the Readiness Project, and Youth-Nex, the UVA Center to promote effective youth development. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. This is a Zoom meeting, which means you can use video and audio. Please try to remain muted throughout the presentation until prompted by the presenter. You're also welcome to leave questions throughout the presentation in the chat feature within the Zoom program. This meeting also has closed captioning through the live transcript feature, which you can select to show or view the full transcript through options in the Zoom program. If you need a certificate of participation from this session for accreditation or other purposes, please email youth-nex@virginia.edu. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the series website after the session. If you haven't already, please also make sure to sign up for our remaining sessions on Wednesdays in July. They'll all take place at the same time. We'll make sure to put a link to the sign up page in the chat. While we're on a virtual platform today, we would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that each of us are on today. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the First Nation people that call this land home. We all know that it has been one of the most challenging 18 months many of us can remember in our lifetime. Whether returning to the classroom for the first time since early 2020, transitioning from hybrid back to regular schedule, or returning to a routine with less disruption, this fall will be a critical inflection point for the adolescents in our communities. From my own reporting and research, I've seen how tweens and teens have been deeply impacted by the pandemic itself, by shutdowns, by social movements, episodes of racial violence, and nationwide reckonings that followed, as well as a changing political landscape and all the details that really shaped the past 18 months. While many of our early efforts of support focused on younger children, now is the time to turn our attention and invest deeply in adolescence. Throughout today and the rest of the series, our hope is that you will more deeply understand the adolescent experience over the last 18 months through both science and hearing directly from young people. We want you to consider how we cannot just build back focused on our own systems, classrooms, or programs, but build forward together. And finally, our hope is that we can reimagine what schools might look like this fall to most effectively support adolescent learning and development. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Fuligni, professor at the Psychiatry and Psychology departments at UCLA and co-executive director of the Center for the Developing Adolescent.
Thank you, Lucy. It's a real pleasure to be here. The Center for the Developing Adolescent is very honored and privileged to be able to collaborate with our partners, Youth-Nex and the Readiness Project to present this very important series on thinking about adolescent development as we're moving forward into the fall. Just briefly, the Center for the Developing Adolescent is dedicated to improving adolescent health, education, well-being through adolescent science and developmental science. Our work focuses on making research on adolescent development useful and accessible to policymakers, youth-serving professionals, parents, and young people themselves, and to inform equitable policies, programs, and practices. Our focus today, as the first webinar of this series, is on the broader developmental needs of adolescents and how we need to consider the whole adolescent as we plan to bring our youth back to in-person schooling. We will talk about these unique developmental needs and these unique skills of adolescents and how we can best meet those needs and enhance those skills, considering the many challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic has created for so many young people and for youth from some groups more than others. The main takeaway is that adolescence is a key period of learning and exploration in so many ways, not just academic and not just school learning. And when we recognize and support that, we will see benefits to youth both inside and outside of the classroom, as well as benefits to our families and communities. So with that introduction, I will start going ahead with my presentation. I will go through a series of slides. I don't have a ton of slides, but we're going to make some few key points. Lucy's going to be monitoring the chat function, and she will highlight anything to me that I might want to mention. So are we good? Okay. All right, let's get started. Let me just move something out of my way so I can see all of you better. Okay. The key take home as we think about broader adolescent development is that adolescence is really a time of remarkable opportunity. A unique period of plasticity and development, and really truly unique skills that provide both the youth and ourselves as schools and communities and youth serving professionals tremendous opportunity to put youth on very positive life trajectories. It's a very important period of growth, as we know. And one way it's important for us to think about this growth is to break it down into different potential stages of adolescence. We find it useful to think about early, mid, and late adolescence, as many of you do. These roughly break into the periods of middle school and high school and after high school. But the key point here is that across the ages of 9 to 25, it's a period of remarkable growth as we discover, learn from, and adapt to the world around us. The way in which we discover, the way in which we learn from, and the way in which we adapt is going to depend a little bit upon whether we're an early, mid, or late adolescent, as many of you in the audience today know, based upon your work with these different populations. But I think that's an important thing for us always to remember when we're bringing youth back to in-person schooling, that really the point of this period is to discover, to learn, and to adapt to the world around us more broadly. We experience a range of physical, social, and emotional behavioral changes. Our relationships expand to include new people. So as we know, we think about the expansion from not just family, but thinking about peers, and not just peers, but thinking about other adults in the school and in the community. This is an important period, evolutionarily speaking, when we think about our species. It's an important time for us to sort of think about how we are going to integrate with the world around us. We're trying to figure out how we find a place in that world around us. That is a fundamental task of the adolescent period. We learn to make decisions and to develop autonomy and agency. And so what we need to do is have opportunities in which we learn to make those decisions in different contexts and different situations. And we increasingly learn how to have agency such that we can make those decisions either by ourselves or in collaboration with our peers and those around us, that we're not simply just accepting the decisions of adults, parents, teachers, and other adult community members. And then finally, we explore identities and become more engaged with our communities. And I think this is really important to keep in mind across the adolescent period. Identity development is happening whether you're 9, whether you're 10, whether you're 16, or whether you're 21. When you're 9, it might have simply to do with what's my identity within my particular classroom or within my particular family. When we're thinking about 16, it starts to get broader. When we think about 18, it gets to be broader. It could be my role in my particular family or my particular classroom, and increasingly becomes, well, what does it mean that I identify as a woman? Or what does it mean that I identify as a person of color, or as a Mexican American, or as an Asian American? How does society view me? All of these things are going on during this adolescent period. And all of this is important components of this idea that it's a period of change and discovery. So one way that we find it helpful to think about this, and I know that many of you in the audience do so as well, but I think it's useful for us to sort of go through this when we're thinking about the transition back to in-person schooling is to keep in mind the key developmental needs of adolescents. Clearly, they need to learn in school, but at the same time, learning is not just academic learning, it's also social learning. It's also learning how to be with your peers. It's learning about community. It's learning about your emotions. And we need to think about all of these fundamental developmental needs of adolescents as we're thinking about meeting the needs of the youth as they're making the transition back to in-person schooling. So what are these key developmental needs? We can sort this in many different kinds of ways. We find it useful to think about 5 or 6 key developmental needs. One is that adolescents need safe and satisfying ways to take healthy risks and explore the world. The way developmental scientists think about risk-taking is that risk-taking is all about learning. The only way that you learn about the world is by taking risks. And what that means is that you're making a decision when you don't know you're not certain what the outcome is going to be, but you have to make that decision in order to learn about the world around you. And that is a fundamental part of learning, and it's a fundamental part of adolescent development. When you have less experience about the world, you need to take risks to learn and to explore that world. Secondly, adolescents need real-world scenarios in which to build emotion regulation, problem solving, and decision-making skills. What we need to think about is whether or not providing opportunities for youth to learn how to regulate their emotions. It doesn't mean that they need to be in settings in which they don't have the opportunity to express their emotions, or that we need to squash the very intense emotions that a lot of the adolescents will experience in either a middle school or high school. They need to have those experiences so that they can learn how to direct and to regulate those emotions. In fact, the brain needs those experiences to make those kinds of connections that are going to enable us to regulate our emotions, to solve problems, and to make key decisions as we move into adulthood. We need to have these experiences. We need to have avenues to develop a sense of agency, identity, and purpose by contributing to peers, families, and communities. When we think about agency and when we think about identity and we think about purpose, what we're really talking about is, what role can I play in my world? What role can I play in my family? What role can I play in my school, in my classroom, in my peer group, in my community, in the nation, in the broader world? These are fundamental developmental tasks and needs of adolescents. This is what they are thinking about. If you spend any time talking to adolescents and asking them about what's important to them, they, just like adults, are thinking about their purpose in the world. They may talk about it in slightly different ways. It may have to do with how it fits in with their more proximal social world. Increasingly, as they get older, it will have something to do with their community, their school, and so on. But they need these avenues to think about this. What role are they going to play and how they can contribute? Youth really, really want to do this. They need healthy ways to do this. If they're not going to have healthy ways to do this, they're going to find other ways to do this that may not necessarily be healthy for themselves or for the communities around them. They need positive, attainable ways to earn respect and social status. I think this resonates for many of us in this webinar today, that adolescents are very attuned to whether or not they're being disrespected. They want to pay a lot of attention to whether or not they have a role and a place to play. It's not like being an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old. When you're 12, 13, 16, you want to, just like we as adults, want to have a measure of respect and want to figure out where we play, what place we have in the social world. So we need to provide them with positive, attainable ways to do this. We just need to support them to develop values, goals, and personal group identities. And then finally, they continue to need warmth and support from parents and other caring adults. Many times we will think that adolescents really don't want that warmth and support, that they're pushing away that warmth and support. Time and time again, evidence points to the critical need that parents and other caring adults still play for adolescents. All of these developmental needs that I just went through, 1 through 3, 4 through 6, have been impacted by the experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is just, we can look at this in a variety of different ways. This is a survey from Australia, and we looked in which they asked youth about their level of distress related to COVID and the different reasons for that distress. You can see there's a rank order of the different factors that they reported being more stressed about. What's important here is if you look at what's considered at the top and what's considered at the bottom. At the very bottom are concerns about themselves, about whether they're going to get sick, whether they're going to catch COVID, or whether they may die. At the very top are social related concerns, not being able to see their friends, number one, but right up there, friends and families getting sick or ill or catching COVID. Extracurricular activities, social events, traveling, and my education. All of these things, if you think about this, have to do with whether or not they are going to be able to spend time with others, whether they're concerned about those that are close to them, and whether they're going to have the opportunity to get out there, participate in activities, to travel and to explore the world. Concerns about others and their ability to explore the world were their ideas of the fundamental things that COVID did to them in terms of creating their sense of distress. As we all know, there were fundamental structural changes in COVID, more time with family, more time at home, more time online, less time at school, less external structure. For many youth, less sleep. Actually, for some youth, it was more sleep, but for many youth, it was less sleep and less face-to-face interactions. These are fundamental changes that would impact all of these developmental needs that I just went through. And the research that is starting to come out suggests that how this impacted youth in terms of mental health in particular really depends upon whether that factor was stressful or supportive in the first place. So if you had a supportive family environment that was safe, that was a positive for the youth. If they were in a very difficult family environment, or if they had family that experienced significant trauma because of the COVID epidemic, that in turn created more distress for them. If they were very stressed about school in the first place, if they were very anxious about school, dreaded going to school, or even more moderately were stressed by a lot of the academic demands of school, they did okay being away from school because that source of stress was removed for them. So really, just like everything else about the pandemic, it really seemed to be a divergent impact that in many ways depended upon youth's initial vulnerability and the context in which they lived. So rather than the great equalizer, again, COVID was the great divider in terms of its impact upon youth mental health, which had a lot to do with their initial vulnerability based upon their context, or perhaps even their initial vulnerability based upon initial challenges that they may have had in terms of their mental health. These bits of evidence are still starting to come out. We're going to be learning more and more in the coming years about the impact of COVID on these kinds of things. So moving forward, how can we think about supporting the positive development of youth as we rebuild, as we move forward, as we try to create, rather than, quote, going back to normal, but creating a new normal? In many ways, if we think about this, this is a tremendous opportunity, okay? A very challenging time for us, but it's a tremendous opportunity for us to rethink the ways in which we educate youth, to rethink the ways in which we construct the settings in which we place youth, the ways in which we think about the interactions between these different settings of youth, whether it's inside of school or outside of school, whether it's the mental health services, juvenile justice services, foster care services, all of these kinds of things. This is a tremendous challenging time, but it's a tremendous opportunity for us to really rethink how we can construct the settings in which we place youth such that we can promote positive developmental trajectories more broadly. And when we think about this in terms of learning and schooling, when we meet the fundamental developmental needs of youth, learning and academic learning and school learning is going to be enhanced. So how can we support positive development? Well, forgive me for oversimplifying at this point, but again, we're just going to sort of lay out some of these basic ideas. We're going to have some breakout sessions in which you will be talking and thinking and sharing some ideas of how you are already putting this into place in the work that you're doing for youth, or the ways in which you're thinking about it, or perhaps a way in which you didn't necessarily think about it moving forward. But this is where we think from the Center for the Developing Adolescent, where thinking about these core developmental needs is very useful. And let's just keep thinking about whether we're meeting these core developmental needs in the settings in which we're placing youth. So let's think about these first three needs: safe and satisfying ways to take healthy risks and explore the world. As we think about moving back to in-person schooling, let's think about, are we supporting healthy exploration across their daily lives, in the classroom, outside of the classroom, in extracurriculars, and after-school activities? But remember that reentry may feel risky by itself for youth. Simply going back to school may seem risky and feel risky for the youth and for their families. So I'm talking to you from Los Angeles. Los Angeles was heavily impacted by the pandemic. Some communities within Los Angeles were tremendously impacted by the pandemic. And many of the families in those communities are understandably nervous about sending their kids back to school into public settings, because so many members of their family and their community were impacted by COVID, and many of them experienced tremendous trauma and loss because of their high density living situations, because many of them worked in occupations in which they had to immediately go back to work, and for a variety of other kinds of reasons. So for many of our communities, going back may seem risky itself. So we need to be acknowledging that and thinking about that. But at the same time, we need to think about, within this context, when the youth are coming back, we still need to give them opportunities to think about how they can explore the world in the classroom, in their broader school, in their after-school activities. Are we promoting this sense of exploration? Secondly, for the real-world scenarios, in order to help build emotion regulation, problem solving, and decision-making skills, we need to really think about helping youth to navigate the complex emotions that many of them are experiencing. They're experiencing stress because their families are experiencing stress. They're experiencing stress because they've been away from their friends. It's going to be difficult for them to even come back to school and to think about how they're going to be interacting with their peers again. There is a lot of, as we look in the popular press, there's a lot of funny articles out there about, how are we going to remember how to interact with one another when we get back to interacting socially by going to a restaurant or having a family gathering and so on. Let's think about what that means for youth, okay? Every social interaction, when they're in middle school and particularly in early high school, has a lot of meaning to them. So these may be even more stressful for them as they get back to school. So let's think about how we can help them to navigate those emotions as they're trying to learn how to get back to these social interactions. Thinking avenues to develop a sense of agency, identity, and purpose by contributing. It's important for us to think about youth as partners as we're thinking about rebuilding. Right now, if we can, let's think about incorporating youth in getting their ideas about what the school day should be like. What should we be doing in the classroom? What should we be doing in extracurricular activities? How can we acknowledge each other's stress and trauma that they've gone through? How should we reconstruct this activity in ways that are supportive to their needs? Many of us who have worked with youth know that they want to have an impact. They want to play a role. They had a huge role in the social justice movements that we saw last year and continuing forward. How can we build upon that energy to enable them to have their opportunities to develop a sense of agency, identity, and purpose? There is very important and exciting work that has basically gone on for decades, but more and more that is coming out, that a sense of belonging in schools is very critical for motivation and academic performance during middle school and during high school. It's even more important for youth from marginalized communities. And one of the best ways to make youth and students feel that they belong is to allow them to contribute, to allow them to feel that they have a role to play in the settings in which they live their daily lives. So thinking about those kinds of things as we design our settings, can we think about that even more than we have before as we're thinking about this move back to in-person schooling as an opportunity to reconstruct the way in which we have set up the settings of adolescents' lives. Positive, attainable ways to earn respect and social status. Let's think about ways of recognizing their remarkable resilience and creativity that they have shown. Recognizing and acknowledging the trauma and stress that many of the communities and youth have experienced, but also acknowledging, praising, uplifting their resilience, and acknowledging their creativity in the ways in which they have supported one another during this pandemic. Many of you are very familiar with the ways in which they've used social media to support one another. Try to think about acknowledging that. We incorporate that. Think about the ways in which that has been a positive for many of the youth during the pandemic as they've been apart from one another. Support and to develop values, goals, and personal and group identities. It's important to think about that these may have shifted over the last 18 months. It's not just that youth they ended and then they're going to return back to school and nothing has happened in terms of what's important to them, what they want to be, what it means to be a member of American society, or in Los Angeles or New York or Boston or Chicago or in Iowa today. What does it mean to be that member now that you're part of the pandemic generation? What does it mean given the social justice movements that we've seen over the past year? A lot of their energies, a lot of their interests may have changed over the last 18 months. And it's very important for us to give them opportunities to think about what that means to them. And then finally, as we all know, they need continued warmth and support from parents and other caring adults. It's important for us to think more broadly about this idea of focusing on a healthy transition and perhaps a little bit less on catching up very quickly. As our communications director, Megan Ford, as we're talking about yesterday, she was pointing out and reminding me that it took us many, many months to adjust to the transition for social distancing. We should expect the same long period of transition for youth to move back to in-person schooling. Okay, so we need to allow all of this time. We need to allow all of us who work with them and the youth time to make this transition healthy in a well-paced way that we're acknowledging all of their developmental needs and not just focusing on learning loss. We will catch up with the learning for those that need to catch up when we address all of these basic fundamental developmental needs. So this is just the summary. These are the things that I've gone through. These are things for us to think about as we're making this reentry, supporting healthy exploration, helping them navigate their complex emotions, see them as partners, recognize their resilience and creativity, create space for them to reflect on what this past 18-month period and continuing period is going to mean for them, and for us to, again, give them space, give ourselves space to deal with this transition back to in-person schooling, which will be very challenging for many of us. So with that, I'm going to stop there. In a few minutes, we're going to have opportunities for breakout periods in about 5 or 10 minutes, but I'm going to stop sharing at this point, I should say. And then I'm just going to take a few moments. We'd like to take a few moments to talk to Lucy, who's just gotten back on the screen. So maybe if you can put us both on the screen, yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Now, as Lucy had pointed out, she is a reporter for YR Media. She's done a lot of very important reporting over the last 18 months about the impact of the pandemic on youth. And I'm just very curious to see whether or not the kinds of things that I've been talking about as a scientist, sort of what the science is telling us from what we knew about adolescent development beforehand and what it's starting to tell us about the impact on youth today, whether or not any of this resonates with you, the kinds of things that you have found, or whether or not you think we as scientists and practitioners have been missing as you've been talking to me. Does anything jumped out to you from what I've said so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the 6 kind of needs that you highlighted definitely ring true. I think it is very different thinking about older adolescents versus younger adolescents. I think most of my reporting has centered on the middle and later adolescent group. but I think you're right. And I think that many adolescents have been adjusting and kind of meeting their own needs in ways that adults haven't necessarily been able to bring that to them in a way that they could maybe pre-pandemic. A lot of my
So you said they've been meeting their own needs. So it sounds like they've searched out new and different ways to try to meet some of the challenges that they have faced. What kinds of things have they been doing?
Yeah, I think, well, we saw youth poll workers, for example, in kind of unprecedented numbers this year. And I think obviously that had to do with the pandemic. And it's also about meeting that need of risk and kind of community action and finding a role to be, to move your community forward and be active. I think you're absolutely right in that young people were leading protests across the country. About a year ago in last June, there was not necessarily one leader for the Black Lives Matter movement, and there still isn't. But if you looked into individual cities like Portland and San Francisco, you can see how young people are leading those protests and kind of being catalysts for social change in that way. I also think it's important to think about how many adolescents still feel the same pressures as they did around school and other sorts of, their family lives, and as they did before the pandemic, and that those things are never going to shift back to normal. And so that can be an added pressure for many young people that, these are important years in their lives, and it's hard to kind of understand how they've been um, taken away and how they probably won't go back to normal. But I do think it's important to think about moving forward in a better and rebuilding better.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? You had mentioned that in the beginning that perhaps they were finding ways to make a difference or to deal with their own challenges because maybe they weren't getting what they needed from adults and so on. What do you think they're looking to from adults as they're moving forward, or are they not looking at all? Are they just sort of, are some of them just so frustrated by the situation that they have been placed in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're always looking to adults, even if they don't express it in ways that are easy for adults to understand.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they are looking for that warmth and compassion that you were talking
Mm-hmm.
about. And I think in both my personal experience and reporting experience, I think in the spring of 2020, when all of us were moving online, there was a lot more compassion and warmth than there was in the next kind of in the fall of 2021. And people, raised their expectations in online school and socially, and it didn't, nothing changed truly from spring 2020 to fall 2020. So I think that adolescents are still looking for that compassion and thoughtfulness around how this is still not normal and how they are still not going to be functioning normally and developing normally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That there's a lasting impact of what they've experienced. I think the other point that you raised is it's important for us not to think about the pandemic impact upon youth. That you pointed out, very importantly, the difference between what was going on in the spring of 2020 and then the fall of 2020, and now that we're in 2021, that there are different stages of this based upon the initial experience and so on, and whether there's fatigue experienced by people who are supporting youth or even from the youth themselves. I think it's important for us to be thinking about that. And as some of the science has come out about the impact of the pandemic on youth, it really is important to look at when people have collected these data, because it really makes a big difference. And as you pointed out in the beginning, some of the data suggests that people were anxious and nervous, but you did not see some of this the impact of long-term distancing from the social world in person kind of impact that you started to see, I think, in the fall and increasingly in the spring of 2021. If there is, based upon your reporting and your own experience, if there are one or two things that you would really think that those that are working at middle school and high school really should be doing and thinking about to provide to youth, what would you want them to be thinking about?
Yeah, I would say space to take risks, as you're talking a lot about, and space to fail in a safe kind of way. I think that you're absolutely right that young people need to take risks and they need to learn, and to, in a pandemic, that can mean being unsafe, and no one, wants that for adolescents. And so I think it's important to, obviously, if an adult is monitoring a task too much, then it can't really be a risk. But to kind of provide spaces to grow and push adolescents in ways that they might have missed out on throughout the pandemic. And I guess a second thing I would say, again, just compassion and understanding about the years and experiences that they've missed out on. And all of us have lost time, but it's easy to forget how big a year feels to a 9-year-old and to a 13-year-old and to an 18-year-old. And so I think understanding and, again, giving them time to grow and make up for that.
I think those are two excellent points, Lucy. One is the part of taking risks is failing, and giving them a safe space to fail is absolutely critical. And I can get really wonky from an experimental point of view in terms of actually when you take risks, the only way that you can learn from risks is by failing. And the adolescent brain is designed actually to pay attention to those failures and to update its knowledge very, very quickly so that you can then learn the situation. And they do this much better than younger kids, and they do this much better than adults. So sorry for getting deeply wonky, but the adolescent brain is designed to do this. And of course, they need to fail in safe ways, as you pointed out, so they don't hurt themselves and others. But I think the second point is just, as you pointed out, continued compassion throughout the year, that we're not going to know at any moment when they're going to need support. They might have a mental health crisis at any point, whether it's acting out or externalizing or internalizing, and we need to prepare ourselves for that. I think those are great points to make. Okay, so I think we're actually moving on to the next stage here, which we're going to move to breakout rooms. We'd love to hear from actually, I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to share my screen again. And before I explain, well, actually, let me give you the lead. We'd love to hear from all of you about how any of this connects with the work that you're doing. Thank you very much, Leslie. With youth of the past 18 months, you're going to be sorted into random breakout rooms to discuss it with each of the other participants. You see the two questions that you're going to be asked to discuss here. It's going to be shown in your breakout room. You're going to have 10 minutes to talk about this. And then we'll come back together and share back and answer any questions that you have. If you'd rather skip the breakout rooms, you can opt to return to the main meeting room until we regroup by selecting the blue leave button to leave the breakout room. So if you don't want to go to the breakout room and you get placed into the one, just select the blue leave room. You'll go back to the main room and you'll just hang out there until we all come back. But we're going to be placed into these breakout rooms, and we're going to just talk amongst ourselves about these two questions and how they may connect to what we've been talking about so far. We'll come back after about 10 minutes and we'll sort of share some of the ideas. Leslie? Okay, I think we're all coming back from our breakout rooms. I see the numbers coming. I hope this was a useful and fruitful discussion that you all have had. What we want to do is just take a few minutes to share a little bit on what people talked about and what they shared with one another. We're going to do this in a couple of ways. There is a Menti link that Leslie has just placed into the chat. And what we want you to do is to click on that Menti link, and she will share that with us as it's being populated. And that's just a way for us to see live as people have entered the kinds of things that they talked about in their meetings and in their discussions. You can also just throw things in the chat. You can also ask a question if you'd like by either raising your hand or throwing something in the chat. So go ahead, click on the link and throw out some of the things. So the first question was, which developmental needs do you think you will need to be most focused on as you're moving back forward? So youth voice, warm and supportive and caring adults, relationships, that came up in our breakout group definitely as well. Other developmental needs that folks want to enter, what do you think you're going to need to be focusing on or already are focusing on in your activities? Coping and emotions. Strength spotting, that's a great term. I'm familiar with that, but I think that's a really wonderful way to put it is, and I love the term spotting because it really points out the importance of the adult to help the youth identify it, right? So you can identify strengths that they're going to have in their daily activities that they may not necessarily be aware of or are feeling insecure about. Coping skills, warmth and support. Support is out there a lot. Healthy opportunities to explore. Relationships, community comes up again and again and again. What is nice, I think, about this combination, speaking from as a developmental scientist, that it's this combination of exploration, risk-taking with support and scaffolding that is critical. It's not either or. And sometimes when we think about popular conceptions and stereotypes of adolescents, we either think about that they want no support and they just need to do everything themselves, or we have this popular conception that they need to be protected from everything. But what they really need is this combination of the both. And that's really what's showing up here, this independence, navigation, supporting them and scaffolding them, that they can't do it alone, but giving them the opportunity to take those risks and opportunities. This is a great list of items. I also see that Margarita Azmitia put into the chat that they talked about mentoring and allowing students to take a pause, to either take a break or a gap year because there's so much pressure to be constantly on the go. Stop focusing on learning loss and start focusing on opportunity gains. In some ways, we talked about that a little bit in our breakout as well, about the idea that we can set aside times for youth to process emotions and what they're dealing with, but many times, as we know from many of us who work with youth, it's going to happen at any given time in any given setting. And one way to think about this is, and in this coming year, is to allow space within all of our settings, gaps, space, time, flexibility, to allow for those teachable moments, if you will, when there is a trigger for a youth or there's some experience that they have starts coming up because of the pandemic, or someone who has never talked about in class starts sharing about the death of a family member, or someone starts showing how they really have been inspired to go into public health work based upon the pandemic. So can we think about ways in which we can structure our environments to be flexible, so that it might be an English classroom or a social studies classroom or a math classroom, but all of these things still might be coming up. What a tremendous list that people have listed. Let's move on to the second question, given the time. What kinds of support have you seen so far that have been effective? So many of you are already working in person with youth in your daily settings, whether it's maybe you've gone back to school already in some form or another in the spring, or what you're doing over the summer. What kinds of support have been effective? How have you provided an opportunity for youth to deal with a trauma that they've experienced through COVID? Or how have you given them the opportunity to explore and take risks within this environment that's a bit constrained? So professional development for frontline staff, very critical. Reducing pressure to, quote, catch kids up. Training faculty and staff to focus on emotion management, mindfulness, voluntary timeout room was a place for silence. Meaning making, fun and exploration, clear communication, shifting from scores and measurements to how did you do, what did you work on? That's excellent. I know I see Nancy Deutsch nodding her head vigorously. I know that she'll be talking about this a lot when we go on to the next webinar. And this frankly came up in Lucy's comments about this idea that youth feel under constant pressure to perform in the classroom and academically. This existed before the pandemic. This shows up in any conversation I've had with our youth in high school and frankly in college, that they're exhausted by it. And so this could be a way that we can think about restructuring, thinking about this back to school time, this back to in-person school as a real opportunity to really fundamentally rethink what we're asking of youth on a daily basis. Space, space, space keeps showing up. That's wonderful. And it's not just space. It's not just period 5. That's our space to talk about things. I know that what we mean by that is having space within the classroom, within a dedicated activity that may be focused on something else entirely, but not at such a fast pace that doesn't allow those moments where we have, as teachers, we like to think about teachable moments that come up spontaneously. And these are learning moments for youth that we can support them in keeping in mind the developmental needs. What a wonderful list. Leslie gave you the link again in the chat. I urge people to keep putting things there. This is awesome. I've never used this before, but this is a really wonderful way for people to share ideas and thoughts and things that have worked for them. You can access this after the webinar. I encourage you to keep posting there, share your ideas and share one another after the webinar in terms of how we can best meet these developmental needs of youth. Okay, I see that we're at 9:59. Leslie, maybe if you could put on the screen that announces the next few webinars, and we'll just draw this one to a close. Thank you. So thank you so much for spending this hour with us. Zoom fatigue is absolutely real, yet we have such a wonderful group that has showed up to us in the middle of July after a holiday weekend to talk about how we can best meet the developmental needs of youth as we're thinking about in-person schooling. Again, this is the beginning of a joint webinar series that we are doing with, it's a collaboration of the Center for the Developing Adolescent, the Readiness Projects, and Youth-Nex. I want to acknowledge Leslie for providing tremendous support and the infrastructure support provided by Youth-Nex and the inspiration from the Readiness Projects. Megan Forder, the communications director from CDA, who's helped organize this as well. Lucy, thank you so much for taking the time to spend time with us. I just want to point out that we have 3 other webinars, please, that are coming up in the next 3 weeks. Please pay attention to that. We're going to delve even more deeply in terms of thinking about schooling and after school experiences. And we'll have a very exciting webinar with a youth-led panel. Lucy, I'm going to turn it over to you to bring us to a close.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, you covered most of it, but again, if you need a certificate of participation, you can email youth-nex@virginia.edu. You can also access this video, the recording of this wonderful webinar, and other resources on the website later this week. And again, yeah, we really hope to see you at our remaining 3 webinars, including that youth-led panel at the end of July. Thank you all for coming, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.